Back up here, some people filing in. I'm going to turn this over quickly to Maggie Smith. I had Maggie come and talk to my class recently, and I told the class that Maggie's one of those people that anytime I think that I've done anything important or I'm busy or I turn and I look at Maggie and I get a dose of reality on top of all of the challenges of motherhood and all these other things. Army officer, former enlisted, joined the officer corps through a master's program in art, incredible stuff. I've known that Maggie now for several years. She's been deeply involved in the space of what I call convergence. She's a fellow with our program. She is continuing her work on active duty. She teaches at various institutions. She was up at the Army Cyber Institute, now co-director of the
Cyber Project for the Irregular Warfare Initiative.
Irregular Warfare Initiative. Sorry, I lost that for a second, but I'll turn it over to Maggie now, and you can take it away to introduce your panelists. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me here. And when Professor Thorin roped me in, I did not know that I was going to be following Lieutenant General Barrett, which makes me a little uncomfortable and a little nervous, but we'll get through it. So as Professor Thorin mentioned, I am an Army officer. I am actually an Army cyber officer, so you see one in real life. And to begin, I'm going to open with a few remarks of my own to talk about some implications for convergence that I've been thinking about since I was asked to start this panel and after having talked with my panelists. And then I'm going to introduce my panelists, and they'll each give you a little bit further clarification on the work that they're doing in this space and how they're seeing the threat space evolve over time from a theoretical as well as from a practical perspective. So 7 implications for convergence is what I came up with. And the first being that there's increased vulnerabilities. So as states and non-state actors exploit digital platforms for disinformation and cyber attacks, the potential for these attacks to be coordinated and become coordinated assaults on critical infrastructure is also rising. And so that means that nation states in general are more vulnerable. Secondly, there's influence campaigns. So cyber capabilities and artificial intelligence can enhance the effectiveness of any information warfare campaign, which means that the sophisticated manipulation of public information, electoral processes, societal cohesion, and all of these factors together can be very potentially destabilizing for nation states and governments. The third implication of convergence is hybrid warfare. And so convergence really enables hybrid tactics where you have traditional military strategies being combined with a lot of these low threat, but also cyber operations and information operations, which then complicate our responses as well as our ability to deter those types of attacks, because our traditional metrics or frameworks for deterrence aren't really relevant in some of these hybrid scenarios. The fourth one is global competition. So nations are increasingly using these tools in geopolitical relationships to influence those relationships and to use them in their geopolitical rivalries. So this has led to a virtual arms race when we think about capabilities and countermeasures in cyber and information spaces. So it shifts the focus from these conventional warfare to hybrid and asymmetric strategies. Fifth is regulatory challenges, which you're probably going to talk about a lot this week. And this is the blending of these domains, the information space and cyberspace, really complicates a lot of the legal frameworks that we have, as well as the norms which we approach them from. And so challenging governments to adapt rapidly evolving technologies and tactics that it might not be comfortable with today in order to protect itself and be better postured to face threats tomorrow. Sixth is public trust erosion. And we see that all we have to do here is turn on the news and you're going to see 2 very different divergent stories of what America is and what it might be about if you say turn on CNN versus Fox News. And so exposure to misinformation can really deteriorate some of the public trust that we have in our institutions, whether they be our democratic institutions or even our higher educational institutions or the military. And then lastly is intelligence and counterintelligence. My job has changed with the proliferation of ubiquitous technical surveillance. It's much easier to identify and track people in real time, in real space. through virtual means by the proliferation of data that is collected, because our lives have pretty much moved entirely online. And so those enhanced capabilities mean that states are proliferating their ability to conduct sophisticated operations in and through cyberspace, which presents challenges for both intelligence for the US military as well as our intelligence community, but also for counterintelligence and assessing when the adversaries are trying to collect on us. So to address these implications, we really need strategies that combine cyber defense, information integrity, resilience, and resilience in our democratic processes. And so to talk about all of this today, I have amazing 4 panelists, and I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, and then we'll dive right into questions. And I beg of you, don't make me talk the whole time. Please jump in with your own questions. It's much more fun when it's an interactive audience game. And I think our panelists will agree. So to begin, I have Karen Kaya, who's sitting right there. She is a policy professional with over 15 years of experience working with the US government, intelligence, law enforcement, and the military on complex technology policy issues that really focus on the intersection of public policy, government, national security, business, and the information technology. She currently works at CrowdStrike and is focused on cybersecurity policy. Next, I have Mihoko Matsubara, and she is the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist for NTT Corporation in Tokyo. She is responsible for public advocacy to strengthen or expand networks with global thought leaders in academia, government, and industry by sharing NTT and Japan's cybersecurity efforts via publications and speakership. Next is Dr. Ivana Stradner, and she is a research fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Barish Center for Media Integrity. She studies Russian security strategies, and military doctrines to understand better how Russia uses information operations for strategic communication. Her work really examines both the psychological and technical aspects of Russian information security and really focuses on the cognitive domain and reflexive warfare. And lastly, we have Dr. Andrew Whiskeyman, who is a fellow Army officer, retired now, and is a department chair and professor at the College of Information Science and Cyberspace at the National Defense University. He is an internationally known lecturer and has published on cognitive security, information warfare, emergent technology, and strategic foresight. So he served in the Army for 28 years. His last job was as an information professional for United States Central Command, but he has also had deployments to Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So with that, I'm going to jump in and first turn to Karen, reading your name backwards. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your work at CrowdStrike and share what you see in the threat landscape regarding information operations over the last few years. Who are the major players and what are their motivations?
Sure, yeah, thank you for attending. Thank you to the Khan Institute for inviting me. I work at the public policy team at CrowdStrike, a global cybersecurity leader. And we work with policymakers to advance the causes of cybersecurity and privacy. Every country is grappling with how to make cyber policy. And so we try to draw on the threat intel that CrowdStrike's threat intel team sees on the internet and try to inform policymakers on what the threats are, how the threats are changing, how our landscape is evolving. And the CrowdStrike threat intel team really is cutting edge. We have language-enabled analysts that are scouring the dark web and the dark corners of the internet where cyber criminals make deals and negotiate, criminal deals, coupled with all of the information that we get from the targeted attacks that our customers face. So combined with those two, we have a really comprehensive look at the changing landscape of cyber. And before I came to CrowdStrike, I spent 12 years at the Training and Doctrine Command. So really looking at how our adversaries are using cyber to get ahead of us militarily, challenge us, divide us from within, weaken us from within without facing our military on the battlefields, and using all of these tactics, the gray zone operations and, those threats that stay under the threshold of military conflict and giving them plausible deniability while, not risking a wider conflict and, getting them closer to advancing their strategic interests. So what do we see in the cyber threat landscape regarding information operations? So, we at CrowdStrike, we categorize the cyber threat actors into 3 buckets: nation states, non-state actors, and criminals, or cyber criminals. So for the purposes of this conference, I'll focus on the nation states of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But there are multiple nation state actors that CrowdStrike tracks, including some countries like Turkey, which is a NATO member, and South Korea, which is an ally. So we not only look at the threats that are targeted towards the US, but all threats, even if it's targeted towards each other. So one of the things that we see is that anytime there's the cyber domain is a complete reflection of the geopolitical landscape. So any battlefield conflict that's happening on the ground has a direct reflection in the cyberspace. So in the last couple of years, we've seen the high-profile geopolitical conflicts playing out in cyberspace. So Russia, Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the Israel-Hamas conflict. So those, we see heightened information operations there. So I'll start with the 4, the 4 countries that I mentioned, and I'll start with China. So with China, China sees the cyber domain as a place where they can advance their national security, economic interests, their narrative, and their strategic interests, such as collecting intelligence, espionage, strategic intellectual property theft, excuse me. So some of the information operations themes and messages that we've seen from China lately, very consistent with the Chinese Communist Party's themes and messages, that the US dollar is on the verge of collapse, and that that Russia and China are very responsible actors in the international community. And then there's, of course, artificial intelligence generated images of US leaders and these hysterical, frantic states, in contrast to like a calm, looking Chinese president, to kind of contrast those two systems. So similar themes of, the US being culturally corrupt and on the verge of collapse, and China and Russia being, the responsible countries. And so I'll quickly touch on these. We can get into these more later. And then so as far as Russia, as I mentioned, the geopolitical conflict playing out in Ukraine. So we've seen, spam, email campaigns to Ukrainian citizens saying that Zelensky has made a deal with Russia and capitulated, given up the four regions. And so they should just, take up Russian citizenship, and urge, kind of appealing to the Ukrainians, probably fatigue of the 3rd year of war. So misinformation, things like that. That's an example, but there's many, many others. Similarly with Iran, we see, information operations aim to diminish confidence in Israel and support the interests of, Hamas's military wing. With North Korea, it's a little different because their cyber operations are targeted towards generating currency for the country, for the government. They need money for advancing their ballistic missile programs and their warship programs. And so they are so the information operations are seemingly targeted to promote, help their efforts to generate currency, cryptocurrency theft, or things like that. So in the last year, we've had one case study, which is detailed in great detail in our latest threat report, where about 100 people from North Korea got jobs in companies, in the Western companies, and basically just used valid credentials to access these systems and obtained a long-lasting presence in these systems. So the information operations, we see fake personas on LinkedIn, and using that correspondence between a recruiter and a candidate, for example, to plant malicious malware, or even a video, if there's an interview scheduled, the video conferencing link, used as a method to spread some malware. And so I'll just stop there for now, and then we can come back to each of these later.
Yeah, we'll unpack more of that later. Focus in specifically on Ukraine, I'm going to turn to Miho. And I want to ask you about the war in Ukraine and what you see in the cyber and information environments there and how AI is being used. And so are tactics evolving or are they continuing on as kind of a steady state, or do you see things changing?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to share my three pieces of observations from the ongoing war in Ukraine, and also some implications to a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So the first piece of observation is about cyber is an integral part of the modern warfare. The second piece is about convergence and interdependency. And the third piece, final piece, is international public-private partnerships. So first, so not only in Ukraine, but also in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, we've seen that the cyber is an integral part of the modern warfare in modern war. And we will see it in any part of the world and in the future warfare or war or conflict. And as the war in Ukraine has been going on over the last 2.5 years, because the Russians doesn't have to only rely on cyber operations or information operations, they can actually use multiple means to launch kinetic attacks to destroy human lives, but also critical infrastructure services. So we've seen more cyber espionage to collect information for targeting, not only for cyber operations, but also for kinetic and information operations. And the second piece is about convergence and interdependency. So last year, Microsoft published a really intriguing report saying that Russia actually combined cyber attacks, information operations, and also kinetic attacks to target Ukrainian agriculture. And as you know, Ukrainian grain export plays a really crucial role for the global food supply chains. And what happened was that Russia actually started to launch lots of missiles toward Ukrainian agricultural fields to destroy the grain productions. At the same time, they also launched multiple wiper malware attacks against Ukrainian agricultural firms. And not only that, they also launched multiple disinformation campaigns to discredit or decrease the global trust in Ukrainian agriculture exports, saying like, oh, this is actually not for grain export. They are actually trying to export drugs or missiles under the disguise of grain export, something like that. And it's really hard to gauge the effectiveness of combining these, at least 3 different types of methods, but they are trying to do this, even though that we didn't actually see that the Russians were able to synchronize kinetic and information and cyber attacks on the same target. But as the Russians have been continuously launching kinetic attacks that actually physically destroy Ukrainian energy facilities or infrastructures, telecommunication services, and also power plants. I'm not sure if Russia has already realized that they don't have to actually launch disruptive cyber attacks against Ukrainian critical infrastructure services because they can just physically destroy them. So, because as of April 2024, this year, Russians had already destroyed 1/4 of Ukrainian internet infrastructure, and they actually, hundreds Ukrainian telecommunication service providers are already on the edge of bankruptcy. So at that point, and also because Ukrainians' power plants so much reliant on former Soviet era equipment and systems, and they just cannot produce or manufacture those devices anymore in the wartime. So only methods left is to import those devices from the former Soviet era countries in a neighborhood. But they also use those power plants. So how can they use those devices unless they happen to be decommissioned those power plants and they were able to export those systems, big systems, like a massive, heavy systems to Ukraine in wartime. So I think that this winter will be much harder for Ukrainian critical infrastructure services. And not only that, because of the interdependence of other critical infrastructure services and also military operations on the Ukrainian power plants and communication services, it will be harder not only for cybersecurity, but also for the lives and the military operations on the ground as well. And the third piece is international public-private partnerships, and CrowdStrike and Microsoft and Amazon have been providing a massive DRI general support for the Ukrainian, not only the military, the government, but also the critical infrastructure services to share services and the hardware, software, and the cyber threat intelligence. However, can we also expect the same level of support for the Taiwanese and Japanese if anything happens? Because the Russians and the Chinese play a totally different role to play in the global supply chain. And we were lucky enough to have observed Russians' disruptive cyber attacks over the last almost 2 decades. So we've already have been able to prepare a little bit before the war started in Ukraine. But what about China? General Garrett talked about the war typhoon and Flux typhoon, but we really haven't seen the Chinese actual disruptive cyber attacks yet. So maybe it means that we have nobody in this room or outside the room are actually ready for Chinese cyber disruptions yet. So it is really important for us to learn lessons from Ukrainians, but we also have to do our own efforts as well. Thank you.
I think it's really fascinating when you take in all of the information that Miho just laid out for us, the cognitive effect that may have on you, that we might not be prepared for any sort of destructive Chinese attack on the US infrastructure. And that really gets to Dr. Stradner's research on the Russian approach to warfare and how it's very heavily focused on the cognitive space, because a lot of the attacks that we've seen take place in Ukraine, not only they may not have been destructive, but mentally and cognitively they have an impact and influence the population. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you. I would like to actually today concentrate my talk on how actually Russia's military perceives information warfare. Oftentimes in the US, but more broadly in the West, we like to talk about influence operations and some part of random propaganda. For the Kremlin, this is the part of their military strategy, a part of their information warfare. As a matter of fact, I understand that for a lot of people in the West feel uncomfortable talking that we are in an information war with Russia. Russia's Minister of Defense openly talks about that. Last week, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs joins this talk and actually claimed that we are already in information war. I mostly look at as I said, how Russia's military operates. We like to always talk about election interference, and it's 2024. There is no a single day without one article about Russia's or China's or North Korea's or Iran's election interference. But actually, Russia operates 24/7 every single day for years / decades. And I learned mostly from my research how an old Russian Soviet basically strategy is called reflexive control, which is the cornerstone of Russia's information security. So it basically means that you feed your opponent with information that your opponent believes that will benefit him, but actually will benefit you. And if you look at how back then, it was around 1960s, the Soviet Union created a three-part game. One game, they basically model a game with how your opponent thinks. The second game is how Russia thinks. And the third game is how they combine. And that's how they use then influence operations to target the opponent with the perception. And that's why Russia's military claims who has perception superiority is going to win this war, even to this day. Just to give you a very concrete example, so not to sound like a typical academic, talking about nuclear deterrence, just think about even how nowadays Russia is reflexively control us. Some countries in the West were thinking about providing Ukraine permission to strike deep inside Russia with long-range missiles. Several days before that, Russia announced a new doctrine, actually a new approach towards nuclear deterrence. They immediately launched offensive influence operations in the United States, something that I've been observing too, that oftentimes very much resonates with policymakers, but also public opinion about the World War III and Armageddon scenario. That's one of the examples. I can go on and spend like 3 days probably just giving you multiple examples how Russia is reflexively control us without us being even aware of it. So look, oftentimes like in our military, we have also something that is called perception management. So I'm oftentimes thinking like, how can we actually adapt our perception management to actually also reflexively control our adversaries? Because our families who grew up during communism in Eastern Europe, they were largely benefiting from Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, American jazz, and modern art. Unfortunately, nowadays, something like that is not enough. We have to really think about how to go on the offensive influence operation, something that looking at, and how to overload our adversaries, how to paralyze them, how to exhaust them, and how to use deception in that manner to put them on the defensive so they spend time, energy, and resources defending themselves because they also have limited resources. One of the favorite probably Russia strategies is definitely confusing the enemy by polluting the information space. And I love to read Russia's military strategies and their thinking, and they often accuse us of using a swarming strategy. Basically thinking how we overwhelm them with our influence operations. So I always like to say, if they believe that we are doing, then maybe it's the right time that we should be doing something like that. But it's also really interesting because in psychology, it's called projection, because then you really realize also and connect the dots about how they perceive influence operations, how they are using the concept of swarming strategy in the battlefield and how they adapted that to the information space to overwhelm us with in the information space. But really, like, what is new? What we heard earlier today is that probably the only new thing is technology. With social media platforms, et cetera, you can go back to the Cold War and to talk about how Russia was using disinformation regarding HIV and accused the United States of creating that virus, specifically targeting populations, let's say in Africa. Nowadays, if you look, for example, at Mpox, or bioweapons, you can literally just delete mpox and to swipe it like with change it with a HOE, and more or less it's a very similar narrative. The only difference is certainly how they operate using new technologies. And another really interesting thing is, if you read carefully Russia's national security strategy and the information security strategy from 2000, you will see that one of the cornerstone of their information strategy, they like to focus on preserving spiritual, moral, and traditional values. And oftentimes when I say this, a lot of people are laughing. They're like, this is absolutely ridiculous. No, it's not. Because that is one of the key things how Russia's military and intelligence is actually using for influence operations in the West offensively as an ideological component to target specific groups. For example, regarding mpox, that started already in 2022. I've been following that really, really carefully because of bioweapons, so it's all linked. But one thing that I noticed, immediately they started a campaign that actually mpox, that Russia is free from mpox because Russia preserves traditional moral and spiritual values, so it can only target the decadent West. Putin just recently even signed a new decree allowing Westerners to move to Russia to preserve spiritual, moral, and traditional values. So it really, really is something we should be paying attention to. And to finish my talk for this particular section, later we can talk about some things in more detail. I really think like the only way that we can understand how Russia operates is to understand how their military operates in this space, and how they understand why perception superiority matters, why they use even the worst perception instead of influence operations specifically coming from the West. We should also, for example, think about like some official or non-official agreements between Russia and China and how they cooperate in this particular space. And the third point that I would like to also make is that one thing that Russia is really good at, it is to adapt their influence operations. So it's not only anymore about troll farms and bot farms, it's actually much more expansive. What we saw recently with the FBI report, they're using social media influencers, traditional media, less traditional media. For example, something that I'm observing right now in some European countries, they, for example, selected a group of social media influencers, very, very young, in sports, in fashion. They flew into Russia. They gave them what I call a media training, and they came back home. So now I'm looking like their Instagram posts before that media training and after, and it is very concerning, really, to see a result. So I'm going to actually stop here and just to make my final remark that indeed information is the weapon, and we better start pursuing it as such.
Yeah, a rabbit hole that I've gone down is the bioweapons one. One of my duty stations was Aberdeen Proving Ground, which is home of a lot of different testing and chemical development. And there was one period post-COVID or during the COVID pandemic when I was watching Chinese television, and I noticed over the course of a 30-day period, Fort Detrick, Maryland was mentioned 180 plus times. Obviously, I stayed up late and no one told me to go to bed at that point. But it was really fascinating to go then look at the messaging that was coming out and how consistent it was. And I could have put in any sort of message about the US and military bases, and it would have rung true. So it's fascinating to look at it from that perspective. Of course, that was Chinese, not Russian, but similar vein. They learn from each other. Mm-hmm. So now I get to turn to Dr. Whiskeyman. So your military career focused really on information operations, and at the end of it in US CENTCOM, it really allowed you to see firsthand the impact of foreign influence on local populations within your area of responsibility. And so what is or has been the US approach to the information environment, and how does our understanding of cyber and information operations differ from our adversaries in practice on the field?
Yeah, thank you. And Good morning. I think the most significant difference at a macro level deals with the integration of it and the start point. In the West, we tend not to start with the end in mind. There's a pretty famous, at least in military circles, aphorism that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. It's attributed to a whole bunch of different people. And that's not to denigrate folks that do tactical outcomes, but it's an understanding that if you can't supply your forces, very quickly they're going to culminate, and the one that has more supply of weapons or food or water or whatever is going to be able to outlast and win the battle. Well, I add the Whiskeyman corollary to that. Now that I have a PhD, I get to come up with my own formulas and charts and all this other stuff, and it keeps me employed at least until my 3-year term is up and I have to compete for rehire. If you see me busking outside somewhere, have pity on me. It means I didn't get picked up again or my theories were absolute bonkers. At any rate, I add the point to that saying that experts talk information. Not new. It has always been cognitive. And we talk about that in military circles, that it is cognitive. All warfare is cognitive. But then we go right back to the tactics. We go right back to how do I put a particular weapon in a particular spot? How do I maneuver a particular way? And we lose the idea that it's about convincing your adversary to do or not do something, unless you want to kill him. Unless you want to do Rome, Carthage, where you kill all of your adversaries, you have to convince people to stop fighting or to take a different tactic and maybe come up with a peaceful outcome. We fail typically to put that first. We say it in a bumper sticker way, but we fail to implement it. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think we learned bad lessons out of World War II. If you want to think about how wars end and assumptions that we've made and have infused themselves into Western military doctrine and application. I'm not saying we don't need to be experts tactically. We absolutely do. And the convergence of being able to strike precisely has been incredibly powerful in terms of at least the US approach of trying to minimize civilian casualties in warfare. That's been an incredible advance, and I wouldn't want to see that go backward. But just because you can kill an adversary leader somewhere does not mean that you have affected the system in a holistic or meaningful way, or that it's time to take victory laps because you've succeeded and the war is over. If that were the case, the strike on Soleimani would have crushed the Iranians and they would have stopped fighting whatsoever. But I don't think that that's actually what happened by that strike, whether you want to argue it fell within whatever bounds it fell within or not. So I think that approach, that fundamentally different approach of inverting an approach to the importance of the cognitive is really that fundamental difference between the two. Additionally, when you look at this didn't happen overnight with Russia and China in terms of dominance in the information environment. I look back to the fall of the Berlin Wall and what the West did before that in terms of telling its story, of using a multimedia approach, of using all sorts of influencers, of showing a story to the West. I mean, part of the reason we bring so many people to the US to study is not because it's just a benevolent thing. It's because you want to show a better way or a different way of doing things that people can then take back. That's an influence campaign. I'm shocked that the Russians are doing something similar in that respect because it works so well. Well, they've spent the past 35 years building up media brands. Look back at Soviet era television. Looks kind of like North Korean television, but look at RT now. Wow. If I didn't know any better, I would think this is legit. In fact, it was one of my last trips to DC. I was driving around. I like to surf AM radio. I know it's an odd, you like surf AM radio. You never know what you find on AM radio. Radio Sputnik is on AM radio here in DC. And if I didn't know any better, wow, that sounded like a fair and balanced interview, except it was dripping with a particular bias and approach in terms of the line of questioning and everything else. But if I'm not paying attention to know that, how susceptible would I be? And I know I'm susceptible. I mean, so when you look at that distillation down to a military approach, you have a fundamental mismatch in terms of how our military organizations are approaching the problem. And I'll finish with a thought. When it comes to access, basing, and overflight, which is something we think a lot about logistically. I mean, if you look at the Pacific, if you look at support to Taiwan, has anybody flown across the Pacific before? Many of you, maybe all of you. That is a long flight. Now, I'm stating the obvious, but think about how many days it takes to sail a ship with supplies on it across that same distance, because you can't fly fuel that far in any meaningful way, or amounts of food that you might need. And then think about if it's a denied access bit. That's a whole different logistics challenge to support to the Pacific that you have to think through. And so you think about where are bases? You think about where do you have agreements with other nations that you can land or you can put a port in. Now look at what China's doing in terms of its influence campaigns to maybe those very same nations that might be vital from a physical perspective. Look at where your cable landings are. What percent of internet goes over undersea cables as opposed to satellite? It's somewhere over 95%, depending on where you look. Maybe the spots that your undersea cables are more important than your satellites in some instances, if you're looking at volume. Who's protecting that? Or who's spending time wooing the respective governments of nations where they have critical landing spots in a lot of spaces? Are we really paying attention to that aspect of warfare? And then if you think cognitively about access, basing, and overflight, you don't end up as an influencer on Instagram overnight, typically. There's a lot of work in building your brand, your audience, the product you have. Who's spent the past 35 years building access, basing, and overflight in the media environment? There's a Pew report I just read this morning that among 18 to 34-year-olds, now 39% of that population is getting its news from TikTok. Now, why is that a problem? Well, algorithms. What are you being fed? Oh, that's right. Militarily, we're not necessarily focused on that. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't want to live in a nation where the military runs the nation. I don't know about you, but I like the way we have things structured. So it doesn't mean, though, that somehow we need to be prepared in thinking about that piece, because for influence in cyber, you don't turn it on overnight. You have to have your access, basing, and overflight pieces set in peacetime so that should it be needed, you're able to execute it. That's what our adversaries are doing to us right now. The question is, how are we postured to do that? And what does that mean for a free society in terms of who actually sets those conditions and those boundaries and everything else? Thanks.
Sounds like some problems that we can solve overnight.
I expect by the end of today.
Right. I mean, we do have some brains in here. Yeah, it's a really, I had the luxury of teaching up at West Point, and one of the projects that I had my students do in a class that I created on politics and the internet was for 24 hours to keep a journal on their media diet. So meaning anytime that they accessed, saw, or took note of a piece of news, to annotate what platform they got it from, who told them, if it was a physical person, and that type of thing. And overwhelmingly, and this was about 5 years ago, that it was Instagram where people were getting their news, which we know is very algorithm driven. And I think what always makes me think is, what am I missing? So what are the news sources that I'm not seeing because of the way the algorithms are set up and feeding me information? And to your point about how this impacts the military, is you're going to have every single soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, coastie in your formation that is accessing their news from a similar method, probably. And a large majority of them are not as educated as we are to think and creatively think about the news that they're ingesting. And so what does that mean for overall force readiness down the line when you have a bunch of influence operations that are being targeted towards military service members and they're ingesting them whether they're winning or not, and how that influences their willingness to fight over time? That's what keeps me awake at night, for many ways. I want to get back to our practitioners, though, and to ask something that was brought up by Ivana, is that are we seeing coordination across these influence campaigns? And are we seeing coordination on tactics, techniques, and procedures between our adversaries in some of the ways that they're acting to influence the United States or our Western allies? So I cut myself off to Karen or to Miho.
I'm not necessarily the influence campaign expert, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's hard to intelligence, threat intelligence, cyber threat intelligence, like any intelligence is not 100%. So it's hard to say for certain, but based on our intel observations from like analyzing tactics, techniques and procedures, there does seem to, I mean, the adversaries do learn from each other, and there's some definitely like learning, you know, cross-pollination, but it's hard to say. And we have adversaries that we track that we have a difficulty attributing to like a nation state, or we know that they're acting in consistently with a certain nation state's interests and using their TTPs, but like what kind of relationship do they actually have with that government is not, it's not easy to say. So we call them like China nexus or Russia nexus adversaries, but they do seem to be learning from each other.
Hey, Maggie, on an influence side, the answer is emphatically yes. We saw this during COVID, where Russia had something out and China being able to pivot in a way very impressively, but that's what autocracies are able to do. Picked up the same talking points and flooded the zone. And we saw a significant shift in the populations we were studying perception of where COVID came from. It was created by the US, it was spread by the US, and that happened in about a 30-day period from the deluge of disinformation that was out there, or as Rand calls Russia's approach, the fire hose of falsehood. So informationally, they are definitely picking up themes. Anything that's anti-West is being picked up by both sides. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a change in approach. Russia has a very different approach in the space than China does, but they're using the same themes repeatedly and layering in markets, which gives a verisimilitude of veracity to that, to the substance of the message. You're getting it from multiple angles. It must be true. It's more than one source.
Reinforcing fires. How I consider it from a military perspective. So audience, please jump in. If you have questions, raise your hand and I will gladly take those questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, so I want to really touch on this. Thank you all for very, very interesting interventions. I want to jump in on this last issue. And this, maybe the question is not so much coordination between different hostile powers, forces, but rather this interlinkage between different misinformation campaigns that exist both domestically and internationally. In COVID is actually an interesting example, because a lot of the disinformation and misinformation during COVID was not originating from the foreign force, but rather from domestic politics. And maybe when listening to you and also General Barrett before, I was thinking that maybe as long as we have such an unstable information ecosystem, where we have significant problems regarding literacy, and we have significant problems regarding safeguards, and we have an endless amount of actors who are willing to push information, zooming in on one set of challenges, which is the challenges posed in the security domain. It is very important, but it is a little bit like draining the ocean with a teaspoon. There are going to be a lot of actors out there that would be interested in spreading disinformation, misinformation for a variety of reasons. And I wonder how we should then approach this basically state of affairs. Is this simply the technological, political, societal reality in which we live, and we have to conduct our national security challenges in view of this, and maybe the price we're paying for being in the democracy, First Amendment was mentioned before. This is the implication, and therefore there is nothing that can be done, and we will try to, using the Dutch boy and the dam metaphor, we'll try to block the different holes in the dam to the best extent that we can. Or maybe we need, again, maybe this is not something that the DoD should be leading, but maybe as societies, we should be thinking how to approach this information ecosystem in a more comprehensive ways, which would be, which would protect at some level national security, but also protect other very important democratic values, while of course respecting the First Amendment and other human rights, civil rights constraints. So I would be interested in your view, whether how, from which angle we should approach this somewhat of a wicked problem.
From all angles. I'll jump in first. No, seriously, it's not a new problem. And I realize we've had a proliferation of communications technology, but 1898, the US starts a war with Spain over fake news. Spain didn't really blow up the Maine in Havana Harbor. It was pushed by media moguls, right? Like, it's not, in a macro sense, information that's incorrect is not a new problem. Misinformation is just something that's not true. If I tell you it's raining right now, I'm not trying to deceive you. I may think it's raining. Now that may get picked up, and it's not with malintent. Disinformation is deliberate. Somebody taking a piece and really attempting to manipulate a system. I think there's something we can do technically about disinformation. I think you can see where bots are promulgating a story that becomes a terms of service with communications providers to allow or not allow that activity to go on. I think bringing things out into the open from a civil society perspective is important, and being able to have a dialogue is important about what is true, what is not, what's acceptable and what's not. That's an important cornerstone, but that's certainly not DoD's, in my opinion, purview to be running that. That's a civil society issue that we have to be able, more forums like this, to have those sorts of dialogues about that, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree also with the gentleman from the Carnegie Endowment before, as far as educating the population and considering this as not just a military problem, but much bigger problem. Because, for example, the fake LinkedIn persona example that I gave with the North Korean threat actors, I mean, does that even fall into the definition of information operations as the DoD defines it? It's just so much bigger than something that just the military can answer. But as far as the technological answer, I mean, AI can also be used. AI is a very tremendous asset for defenders, and AI can be used to at least spot the fake, the deep fakes. And, while AI is making the deep fakes more realistic and harder to tell the difference, but AI can also be used to fight against them. So there's some hope from a technical response. Okay.
So, as I mentioned, my work focuses mostly on offensive influence operations. I don't work for the US government, so I can say whatever I want, basically. I don't believe that necessarily we have to spread disinformation into any of those countries, because indeed the truth is on our side. But I do believe that it's also high time for the US also to put adversaries on the defensive. I'll just give you a very concrete example. Right now, Russia is pushing a serious campaign to discredit NATO and to show that NATO is a paper tiger. There is evidence for that. What a great opportunity for the West to launch offensive influence operations and to actually show that the CSTO, Russia's version, what I like to call of a mini NATO, is falling apart. Armenia has decided to, or is deciding to abandon it. There are numerous problems, over there. So we do have ideas. We do have the truth as on our side. It's the question of the will. I like to also say, who knows what we are doing that we don't even know. But if we were doing a better job, I would not have this job. That's number one thing, that whether our intelligence or military should be more inclined because that would put Russia on the defensive. The second problem, I think, is talk about integration. There is not even the word, I cannot talk about China or North Korea or Iran, I'm not an expert in those countries, but in Russian language, there is not even particular word for cybersecurity. When they refer to cybersecurity, they only talk about Western cybersecurity. They use the word information security. In two panels, like later this afternoon, we are going to talk about UN Cybercrime Treaty. I'm not going to interfere in that panel, but I will just tell you one thing, that if you look carefully at Russia's version of that treaty, they're talking about information security. It's not a question of semantics. It's a question how they understand and how they combine the technical and psychological part of influence operations. And the third thing is, indeed, we are going to talk later this afternoon on UN Cybercrime Treaty, but there is something that I would like to also raise the question here, that I recently saw that the Russian government has announced that they're going to push for a new treaty on information warfare. Having said that, as a democracy, we already heard that earlier today, what happens if you want to do certain things, that you will have lawyers who will knock on your door and say, you cannot do these things. And the reason why Russia is exactly pushing for that, so we actually jumped into all those agreements and treaties, and to spend our time engineering resources, they do not have to respect any of those things. So we also have to really understand how they perceive influence operations and why it really matters for them also to regulate globally, given this is also international law conference.
Yeah, real quick, I want to follow up on Yuval's point, and understanding that one of the big challenges in this space is metrics. Right? Are these campaigns effective or not? What kind of empirical data can you develop to figure that out or not? Although there's certainly a ton of resources that are being invested in deceptive influence campaigns that would lead one to think that they may have legs to them, right? But the knotty problem is how we look at this from a domestic perspective. Individual speakers who may have whatever agenda to put out their own disinformation, internal politics, et cetera, versus foreign state engagements. I don't know if you can answer this or not, but is there, from an effectiveness perspective, a difference? Do we see sort of the foreign malign influence campaigns and operations having different or greater impact than perhaps some of the stuff that's just floating around from individuals pretending to be influencers or wanting to be influencers on the internet?
I mean, I would guess that even if the message itself doesn't resonate, but if it plants a seed of suspicion or doubt, that still helps them get closer to their goals as far as, dividing us or, making us question the legitimacy of our elections, for example. So even if the final message doesn't come across, it's that suspicion that they sow in our minds that it's problematic. Okay.
So I think it's really difficult to gauge the effectiveness of the influence campaigns or disinformation campaigns toward the West, because we can count on how many posts or retweets or repostings but we cannot really count okay, so these posts, because it was a million times of retweets, we actually changed the course of our actions to actually hate ourselves more and leaning toward to authoritarian states, or we will stop fighting if anything happens in the Taiwan Strait, or for instance. And also we tend to focus more on what's on the social media, including TikTok, because we can count. But they do not have to only rely on the social media. They can also do in the physical domain, like entertainment or invitations, or a personal favor in invisible ways in a professional environment. And can we actually incorporate all of the intelligence into to how to counter or at least minimize the risks towards the Western countries? I haven't seen that yet.
So just a brief thing, I absolutely agree with you that it's very difficult actually to measure causality. And that's why I think it's really also high time maybe to shift that question, whether we are winning or losing in the information war, because that was also the question during the Cold War. Maybe we can really start thinking about, I call a spade. This information war is a protracted war. So basically we can be winning on a part, let's say scale 1, but then tomorrow we can lose, on the third day we can win. So it goes like this. So I think instead of thinking whether we are losing or winning, maybe we can really start thinking about this as a protracted war and the overall effectiveness. Because otherwise, how can we even say like when the war has started or finished? So.
I'd offer, I think that it's a misapplication of metrics. It's like trying to use science to measure philosophy. It doesn't work. It's the wrong tool. And we've been caught up in that in the US, at least since the Second World War. When you look at tons of bombage and what we bombed and trying to find the body count in Vietnam of the tipping point. We're looking for a reductionist approach to an answer to have certainty in our approach of what we're doing. And that's a complete misapplication of the metrics approach and the wrong question that we continue to ask ourselves. And so there's a qualitative approach sense in this, because I could look at the room right here, and if you did a snap poll, you may get 95% of people who hit yes, I'm paying attention. This is the most fascinating panel I've had today, even though it's the first one. But yet looking at the crowd, everybody's maybe checking email or booking something online tonight or doing something else. You don't know, as everybody sits behind a screen, whether they're actively engaged with material or not. And so you get a different answer in the metric that you drew, vice the je ne sais quoi of the room. I just exhausted my French, right? And so you get a different feel for that. What is that thing that's there? And we are uncomfortable in that space collectively because we have fallen into an industrial measurement perspective of trying to squeeze efficiencies out. And that gets to how do we grow leaders within policy, within the military, within civil society who are comfortable in the uncomfortable of making a judgment call based on how it feels, in a sense, on the experience they've had. That is a tougher call because you're not going to get that equation of the causality. If we ran this ad, we got this many views, and these many people raised the right hand and became Jeffersonian Democrats. That just that equation doesn't exist.
Yeah, all fair enough. The reason I asked the question, though, is you can't, certainly in this problem area, neatly segregate between something that a state is doing, what those impacts are, and oftentimes those states aren't even creating the content. They're picking up locally created content and seasoning it and amplifying it, et cetera. So there's going to be some trade-off, and the lawyers in the room knows what we'll get into. There's trade-offs on, well, is there a First Amendment impact or not? Well, we're talking about the Russian state here. Well, yeah, but you can't neatly separate and segregate it. And so I don't know if it's doable. I don't know if it's possible, but understanding where the predominance of the impact is, if you're going to consider measures to persistently engage with state malign influence campaigns and so on, can you at least at some level get a sense of, yeah, that's where the predominant problem is. That's where most of the effect is happening. That's where the cognitive space is being primarily influenced from. And the collateral impact on the domestic, individual, more highly protected space will be minimized, or not. Like, that's one of the challenges.
There's some really interesting examples. The first real media war was the Gulf War, where there was American shock and awe. It was like CNN I was a kid at that point, but I remember the CNN graphics very vividly. And if you look at the behavior or the understanding of our adversaries based on that real, like Schwarzkopf's information operations that he did, which showing US power, you see changes in their tactics. That's like a very neat example of where something that we did in the physical space in a very thoughtful manner to present shock and awe had impacts on our adversaries and how they approach warfare. But from something that's much more close to home is when we look back to 2016 in the city of Baltimore, we had the death while in police custody of Freddie Gray. And Russia was all over that, all over both sides of the narrative. And this is well documented. And the culminate by researchers, you can Google, Baltimore disinformation and 2016. But this was like pre-election and getting an understanding. It was very much considered a learning process for Russia about how they could use domestic unrest to amplify or create broader divisions in areas that are already divided, like being pro-police or Black Lives Matter. It's not a dichotomy, but it was presented as one. And so they really created a whole bunch of social media accounts that amplified both sides of that narrative. And the end result is that they got Americans into the street on both sides of that argument at the same time. So you had, in my brain, it's like this sea change moment where you have a foreign adversary in the virtual space and information space, manipulating the minds of American people to get them to go to a protest in the same location, on the same city block, at the same time, when essentially asking people to get into fistfights and get into real arguments. And like, that was a gut check moment, not only because we live in Baltimore, but like, because that was a manipulation of the American public physically. Because it's one thing to manipulate somebody in the information space and in the digital space, but to get them to physically do something is a whole nother level. Like I want the information space to manipulate my 16-year-old daughter to passionately care about something, right? But like to get her to act is like a really big deal. And what we saw was people got out in the streets because Russia was seeding both sides of that information environment and inflaming tensions on both sides.
But Gary, that's a hugely important point that we really need to wrestle with how do we think through that from a legal perspective of an understanding? And it's not new. A guy named Edward Bernays gave an address to the press club here in DC. I think it was in September of 1941. And what he outlaid about the Soviet approach to sowing disruption between fractured groups in the US, because we have a strength in our diversity, but we have weaknesses when those divisions are exacerbated. If you erase Soviet in 1941 and put 2024 in Russia, it reads the same way. It's not, I think to your point, a lot of this is not new techniques. It's just a new use of technology. And we haven't dealt with that since then, right? So this is something that we really need to think through. How are we approaching this? Because it's the very real divisions that come up within our society that are manifested in the physical.
Lots of questions. I'm going to go in the middle there and then I'll come over here. So, yes.
Oh, yes, thank you. Is it working?
We can.
Yes, so I'm Irene Kouzigu from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. So I would like to thank the 4 panelists. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. But my question is more for Karen, I suspect. So I'm interested in the role of the private sector in addressing disinformation. So I'm wondering what is the exact relationship between your company and states. So do states ask for your help to attribute disinformation campaigns, to react to them? So could you develop a bit more on that?
Yeah, and I can actually, that's a great question, and I can use that to go into some of the policy discussions too. So we're getting shorter on time. So yeah, so our team, we do help, draft public comments to help governments, to deal with some of these things based on what we're seeing, and the governments do have a role to play, and policies do have a role to play in countering these things. So, I mean, policies can mandate or incentivize the use of best cybersecurity practices, raising awareness, critical infrastructure protection. The states, or I mean, when I say governments, have authorities to issue arrest warrants or sanctions that the private sector doesn't have. So certainly the executive order, for example, 14028 on the improving the nation's cybersecurity, improved and incentivized, logging practices, endpoint detection and response. The federal zero trust strategy incentivizes the use of zero trust principles. So there's a lot of role for the governments, and the way that we work with them is to, again, like conveying what we see in the threat intel space to inform them with their decision making. Now, there's a lot of challenges with this because technology moves so much faster than the law and policies. So we often advise them where they can to not make policies based on like the latest threat trends, but more based on fundamental principles because the threats are changing so quickly. So don't chase the latest, the trends basically. And of course, one of the other challenges is that cyber domain is so much different than the other domains. It doesn't conform to borders, and so we need to think of the borders as not as the physical border, but as sort of the outer limits of where the state can exercise its sovereignty. And that's where international alliances and partnerships and information sharing becomes really important, because if we're going to redefine borders as the outer limits of that. Now there again, you run into some of the legal obstacles, such as some countries have data localization laws and they won't share data. So there's a lot of challenges there. There's also a lack of common language around even what a cyber incident is. So there's a lot of challenges around that. And then of course, the general lack of education and resources on the actual technological issues that are behind cyber policies. But specifically regarding information operations, what is so challenging? We don't have a common definition of information operations. There's so many different words: misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, psychological operations, which don't even actually encompass the full gamut of all the threats that we see right now with the fake LinkedIn and the fake accounts on streaming channels that perpetuate these false narratives that get millions of views. Does that fall into information operations? Things like that. So that's definitely a challenge. And then of course the freedom of speech argument, which I also will not get into, but I'll leave it up to the legal minds to get into.
Thank you. Svetlana Van Bentham from the University of Oxford. It seems that when we speak about cognitive effect, we don't worry only about the entrenchment or change in specific views, whether true or false, but we worry also about the very process of thinking which is being changed, uncritical ingestion of information, introduction of cognitive biases, creation of silos. And if this is true, it seems clear that what Yuval is saying, we need a strategy which is comprehensive, both in terms of those who are deploying these operations, but also within our societies. But what I would be interested in are some practical measures that you can derive from your practice. Are there certain operations that have been heavily invested on by nation states, but they haven't actually picked up? Or are there societies that are being more resilient than others? What can we derive from this? And what are the actual measures that we can get from that analysis?
Great question.
I'll pull just a piece of it, I think, on resiliency, just to start, and then be done. Resiliency is important, but there's not necessarily an easy technical solution. I think it's the human solution piece of it. I know that there is some nascent research on psychological inoculation, where you present some things. Some folks will talk about pre-bunking, where you try to attempt to present what's about to be told to you that's false to help you identify it earlier. I don't know how long any of that lasts, or if you have to keep redoing it. I would offer an approach is a healthy skepticism to start bringing into communities where you see something, you should take a second and question it. Even if Aunt Sally's the one that shared it on Facebook, right? Or my daughter posted it on Instagram, or wait a second, where did that really come from? There's a healthy skepticism. That's a habit of thought that needs to be developed, which is, again, not necessarily a really easy checkbox approach. I think exposure to instances where it happens, case studies help people to think through that. But these are sort of labor intensive and small group work approach. But I think those show the most promise. I know they have in some things that I've read and just some groups I've worked with of really that approach to questioning, not doubting everything, because that goes off on the other problem end of, there's a whole flat earth society in Brazil. It's like 10 million strong. That's separate talk. At any rate, questioning everything is not it, but a healthy skepticism approach toward that doubt. And then some practice at seeing things that are fake and starting to work through the dialogue of recognizing the patterns of that. And then the last thing is understanding emotions. If you're seeing something that makes you angry, chances are you're being manipulated, because anger is a very easy emotion with which to bring somebody to and then start manipulating them in that direction. Those are some tangible ways to start working on inoculating small groups and then communities at a community level. I don't know how applicable it can be from a whole society. Let's get after all of this. But I do know in small groups, I've seen success with that sort of approach.
So to jump on the mentioning to the healthy skepticism. So in the Nordic countries, they do resilience in education, even for elementary school students. So they teach them how to check multiple news sources to make sure that what you jumped on the first is not necessary speaks to the truth. So that's why the statistics shows that Nordic people have more resilience to the influence campaigns or disinformation campaigns. But I'm not sure that how other parts of the Western countries can also do the same at the elementary school level for the younger people.
Maybe just one quick note. As you said, in particular example of Russia, Russia is adapting their strategy. It's not anymore about recognizing that there are bot farms and different trolls on social media. I think one of the key challenges that we are going to face is definitely through their social media. For example, RT. People claim, for example, it doesn't have like a direct influence, and it does not really have only direct influence, because information from there got picked up, from local bloggers that appeal to certain, population. Because someone who is, a sport or fashion young influencer will have significantly, I assume, more influence on the youngsters than some information coming directly from RT. So they're adapting their strategy. I think that it's going to be a massive problem in the future. And the second thing that I would also like to mention, if I'm not mistaken, I think the CISA, they a few years ago, they made really a funny campaign on social media about pineapple pizza that I wish really it was more viral, because it was a perfect example to take an issue that is not purely polarizing, such as the question of abortion or gun control, and basically, whether people like pineapple pizza, right? Like immediately to show actually how people got upset about that. And angry, exactly, because maybe like to take some non-polarizing, like a polarizing issues, but not politically polarizing, and to teach people really how they're being manipulated, how deception works, like how they trigger your cognitive processes, how, for example, they trigger your dopamine. And that's something that, as I said, I'm not an expert in China, but on cognitive warfare, how they operate directly targeting your cognitive processes. It's something that we should be concerned about. And the third question, as I mentioned, I was mentioning today way many two times, like the US government. But the problem is that one thing that really Russia has been working, why it's also a problematic thing about building resilience, because they will immediately run a campaign claiming that this is the infringement of our free speech, that this is a new indoctrination targeting, specific groups. So we do have a much bigger problem than I think many realize. So.
I would offer that I think this might be a role for international organizations like NATO, where I was at the public forum when it was here in DC, and there was some discussion about, Western like-minded countries having a consistent narrative together about what it means to be part of the West and the liberal world order. And I think, the more the merrier in terms of trying to get narratives right, calling out disinformation when it's known as a targeted campaign is a step that we need to be more heavily involved in and invest in as we move forward. And I think are we getting the yoke, or do we have time for one more? Okay, one more. I was going back over here, sorry.
Thanks. This has been fascinating. I wanted to bring up an aspect of this that I haven't heard yet, which is the Pact for the Future got adopted by the UN yesterday. And I've had the misfortune of being a part of the negotiation of that document for the last 8 months. And one part of that is the Global Digital Compact, which is intended to set the course of how the UN will deal with digital technologies going forward. And while it has been softened, there is a narrative in that document that social media companies and platforms are responsible to an extent that is disproportionate to the rest of society, especially governments. And they should do something to address social media and disinformation and all of this. And this was actually pushed very hard through developing country blocs by Russia and China. So they're not only weaponizing these platforms against our societies, they're then weaponizing the results against us in political terms of these. And the response of the West has been to sort of disagree with this, but it's been pretty weak, honestly, and it's been very Western. And so the irony is not only are they actually persuading our populations of ridiculous things, they're actually persuading the political establishment that the result of that is also to be blamed upon the West. And I agree with Ivana what you said. The Russians have been pushing for an information security treaty for some time, and pretty much everybody in peace and security in New York is convinced next year they're going to try and mount it. Meanwhile, there is no positive agenda from the rest of us. There is just saying no. And just saying no to problems is not going to actually produce a result for the countries like Costa Rica, who frankly don't want their governments to be taken offline by state actors when they are too small to call them out on their own. So I'd be interested in any thoughts that all of you have, because this front, winning the political hearts and minds of UN's member states is a pretty important aspect of this, and it's something that, unfortunately, so far, we're doing very poorly.
Maybe I can say a few things. So as I mentioned, I really do not want to steal arguments from our last panel today, but you're absolutely right that since 1998, Russia has been trying really to regulate information security in the UN. And in large part, as I said, they use international law as a law. Also to push the agenda with China for something that is called digital sovereignty. And as I mentioned, if you read carefully Russia's version, Russia's draft, how they even understand information security is completely different from the Western draft. So it's not only the question of privacy that people are allowed to talk about, the problem with this treaty, but it's also influence operations. Having said that, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, I came across information that Russia plans to push for another treaty, basically to regulate influence operations. And here is the trick. The reason why Russia, with the help of China, was able to accomplish their goals is because with the help from the global South, for the lack of a better word. We already know the tricks, how they were using different groups within the UN and organized a separate group, open-ended working groups. So they probably already know the tricks that they were using for the UN Cybercrime Treaty. Maybe it's really past time to learn something from that and to be preemptively take certain measures for next year when they plan to start a new negotiation on a new treaty.
And just on that, I've thought for a while that largely in the West, we've been fixated on the wrong information fight with Russia in particular. We're looking at Ukraine and saying, oh, the Russians can't influence the Ukrainians. They're losing the information fight. We're beating them. We declassified some intel. We won. But what has Russia been doing across Africa and across South America? And where are populations polling in terms of support to Russia's version of that? What's happening at the UN with Russia? We're fixated on the wrong fight in the information space. And maybe not saying that's not important, but there are other fights going on that I think Russia is definitely engaged in this space that we ought to be paying much closer attention to. And then when you look at things like Mali that happened with the French and some other geopolitical issues going on across Africa, you really have to think through what's the broader global play at this aspect. It's a whole lot bigger than just that one issue.
Anyone else? All right.
We have one more. Is he able to get one in?
Okay, so very quickly, sir, because we have to break for lunch and set up for the next discussion, but your question.
So sorry. So actually, during the keynote addressed by General Marriott, I raised my hand and trying to share some of my perspective. I hope it's still relevant and appropriate to raise my question before this panel. I think it's clear that worries about cybersecurity around the world is increasing dramatically. Last July, the network system of the Wuhan city, the city where I'm from in China, was subject to a major cyber attack, which aimed at hacking data regarding past earthquake record, the geological structure around this area, etc. It was detected that the attack was originated from abroad, and due to the sophistication of this attack, it's believed that it's related to a powerful foreign government. And one of the possible purpose is to trigger a future earthquake through cyber attack. So for those who are willing to believe this could be a real story rather than fake news, a lot can be discussed. From my perspective as an international lawyer, it above all highlights the need and the difficulties of reaching international consensus on what is allowed and what is not allowed in this strategic domain of cyberspace. And number two, where the countries are willing to accept that once we have those rules, those lines, what is allowed and what is not, whether countries are willing to accept those rules are to be applied on the equal footing. Meaning, if country A, something done by country A is to be allowed, then similar behavior of country B is also to be allowed. And if country A is to be regulated by these lines and rules, then country B same. So this is, I think some of the tricky issues related to the discussion of cybersecurity. And I don't know what is the question, and I look forward to the discussion either now or after the session. Sorry.
I'll offer one thing in response is that I think it's always at the forefront of policymakers and strategists' brain that by putting a line down in the sand or by offering up an international agreement, accord, treaty, or definitions, even in the space we lack them, that you are then, you have to be bound by those as well. So that's, I think, part of where the hesitancy has been over time in cyberspace is that the domain is constantly expanding, it's evolving, and so it's very difficult to get people to come to an agreement because people are concerned that the next big thing they will not be able to respond to because it will violate something that's put in stone. But it is an interesting discussion, and some things have started to work towards consensus, I think, in the UN. But next few years are going to be amazing.
Yeah, I'd agree with Maggie. Certainly it's the simple rule of international law. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, we say in English. It applies equally, but we also know that there are violations. Russia is a member of the United Nations. They subscribe, they're a part of the UN Charter. Article 2.4 means what it says. And yet we're watching what's been playing out in Ukraine for years. So there's also an accountability question. And how does international law respond when the rules that we may agree upon are violated? And what the options are for states in the face of those. And that's a lot of what we'll be discussing over the next day or so. I will say, Maggie, I'm from New York, and putting pineapple on pizza is a sacrilege. So you triggered me, I'm manipulable. So, well, okay, who raised the pizza? No, but, all right, thanks to all of you for a great discussion. That is for you, and you can distribute those if you guys would, please. The coveted TLS cup with calories included to make up for what you've lost. So, all right, thank you all. On a brief break, as I said, we'll go out. There's box lunches for those who want to come back.